Karen, I find in conversation with you that I often learn important things about life. It seems like you have some fine insights into the human condition as a whole. And
well, thank you. That's very nice of you to say.
Yeah, and I find that to be stimulating. And I want to talk a little bit about the problem of addiction and compulsion, and to do it especially in relationship to the culture and society in which we live. I mean, I know there's some literature that suggests that we live in an addictive society, and that there are compulsive tendencies in the culture that begin to influence all of us in one way or another. And I think it's important to start out with sort of an understanding of the power of culture to influence our thinking patterns and to give us our assumptions. I think of this simple example that the Eskimos have something over 40 words for snow,
yes,
which enables them to see snow in a way that other people don't. I mean, we just look out and see snow. We got one word to describe what it is. There are patterns in the culture that we ingest. We take them in. They form the grid with which we look at the world. That's so right. If we grow up, for example, in a competitive culture, in a competitive family, we simply think that that's always the way relationships go or human interaction ought to be carried out. We simply assume it because that's the way it's done. Everyone does it that way. I believe that most of us really need to force ourselves to see the power of the culture. I think there's a tendency to think, oh yeah, I put more emphasis on personal, or I put more emphasis on the individual, or I think for myself, or I don't give in to peer pressure. Often got a kick out of a lot of the people in the 60s who were into doing their own thing, who walked around dressed remarkably like many other people. And it just always said, or you've met these flower children in Chicago who used all of the same language or something, who thought they were off on this individualistic kick. So, I mean, it just is remarkable the way we get programmed in. In fact, I think it's rare to meet people who can rise above the culture or to get above peer pressure in some way. Anyway, you want to comment on that general analysis to begin with?
Okay, a couple of things came to mind when you mentioned the people of the 60s. They, I think, became aware that the culture that they had inherited was not to their liking, and so there was this overall rejection. But maybe it's the human condition to want to be like other people, and so they had to form their own kind of subculture. But I think the good thing that came out of it was the initial awareness that maybe everything we are told that our culture inculcates into us is not always good. It's not. It should be examined and re-examined.
Right. Part of adulthood is to be able to sort that out, to sort of take a dialectical view of the culture and to say, well, what is good in it and what isn't. What is, for us Christians, the way we do it is we try to look at it from the viewpoint of the gospel, and letting Christ be the norm for our judgments. And when we do that, we say certain things in our society are in accord with the gospel or further the message of Jesus. Other things seem to militate against it. And those are the things that we have to judge severely and try to overcome. So it's not as though we are simply cultural relativists. I think as Christians, we claim that we have a norm by which we are to examine the culture and sort of sort out the good from the evil.
Right. I also think of the women's movement that exploded in the late 60s, early 70s as coming to an awareness of how the culture had engendered these very narrow, confining gender roles for both men and women. And women were rebelling against that, deciding that, why shouldn't I pursue this profession just because I'm a woman? Or why should I have to kind of sublimate my own ego needs because I want to be in relationship to a man? I remember growing up in high school and reading how if you play tennis with a boy, you should always lose because he won't ask you to play again.
Yeah, sure. And the example, and I use this all the time, but is the way we use sexist language in our culture without ever being aware of it. women used it as well as men.
Yes.
Sang hymns in church that talked about God-loving men and said nothing about women. But no one noticed. And that's the operative point. Women didn't notice and men didn't notice. No one noticed until a few prophetic voices were raised and started saying, hey, this isn't right. And that gives us a clue as the power of the culture to co-opt us, to draw us in, and to give us our set of assumptions or the glasses through which we look at the world. So I think we have to start out with that sort of understanding of the power of culture, which I think is greater than most people suspect. And when they do get into it, I think very often our tendency is to say, yeah, it affects those other people. You know, it gives those other people stereotypical thinking or clouds their vision of reality, but I'm objective.
Yes.
I'm above that.
Yeah.
Well, none of us are objective. We can't climb out of the culture to look at it to see what's good and bad about it. We live within the culture, and all we can do is to find some one of the cultural products, in our case, the whole Christian tradition, and use it as a critiquing mechanism. I think that is one way to keep from getting just co-opted into the destructive tendencies in the culture.
Right. No, I think it's fascinating how people come to an awareness that something is wrong with the messages that they've gotten. I don't know if it's just maybe responding to a sense of wrongness, and it's very fuzzy. They don't know why, but they're not happy with what they're hearing or the way they're living or the way they see other people living. But I think that shows how so important it is to be sensitive to our own gut feelings, because I think down deep within us we have healthy responses that have sometimes been clouded over by a lot of garbage that we've taken in many forms and in many ways from many sources.
We'd have to learn to trust our own experience in a way.
Right.
I think in family relations, you might have a large family where everyone puts up with sort of an abusive mother, say, in the family. And then one child will come along that's simply not willing to do that. And sort of says, well, this isn't right, or tries to rise above it, and that one child then might raise the consciousness of others about it.
Yes.
So I think that does happen. And these people are usually the more prophetic figures, are the ones more in touch with reality and who have a greater sensitivity and have some ability to articulate what is going on. I guess that's why a culture needs prophets. Of course, we never know which ones are the false prophets. I mean, some people might attack a culture for no good reason and come at something that's really quite a fine quality.
There is I just wanted to add, there is a sort of mystery about why some people respond to the same situation and that other people are not responding to, are just accepting. Maybe it's a response to grace, the mystery of grace, and that's where the prophetic voices arise from when there is that response to the grace of the moment. I
guess I would want to say that grace works through nature, as we've traditionally said, and that God's Spirit works with the kind of people we are, with our personalities and characters. So it would seem to me the sort of root of that graced ability is the very personality, the very character that gets developed, being more perceptive, for example, or being more sensitive to needs and hurts and distortions.
Yes.
I think grace works through that kind of personal quality. That's why, your prophets very often turn out to be these really great people in many ways, so that God's Spirit finds an apt vehicle to make the critique of the culture.
And maybe that's why so many great people are very sensitive to the fact that it's not just their accomplishment. It's as if they had no choice, and they don't take credit for it. It's like being born with a high IQ or the ability to play piano by ear. You don't know where it comes from, and you really can't take credit for it. All you can take credit for is developing the ability that's there.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that does capture a lot of the experience of the prophets. Well, Karen, let's turn to our specific question here, which is the addictive culture, the claim that this society fosters compulsive tendencies. Why don't we look at that a little bit, and why don't you say something about that?
Okay. Here's a person who I consider rather prophetic. Ann Wilson Schaaf has written...
How do you spell her last name?
Schaef.
Uh-huh.
And she's written a book called When Society Becomes an Addict. She's a psychotherapist, and she's worked with addicted people. And what she found was that the same qualities that addicted people show personally seem to be manifested in our larger society in general. She sees most people in this culture, whether they're officially addicted or technically addicted to something or not, walking around kind of numbing themselves from reality, from their own feelings, kind of avoiding maybe what's most important in their life, seeking always to be involved in things, because when you're not involved, you start to feel those feelings, or you might feel boredom, which seems to be like one of the worst possible things. She says that most people actually are zombies, in the sense that they have made two decisions. One, they have decided not to die, because one of the things, if you're in a society that and you're unhappy in it, you can choose to just die in some way, whether it's not necessarily physically, but psychologically. But they have not chosen to live either. So they're kind of living in this limbo state, and they're living in unawareness. They're not aware of how society has given them these patterns of behavior and ways of thinking that are really unhealthy and limiting, confining, restricting.
Well, how does the culture induce this? I mean, one way I can think of is through what an author, Marie Wynn, called the plug-in drug, which was her title for television.
Sure.
And
yeah.
The plug-in drug, that sort of numbed people's awareness, that it's sort of a simple pacifying kind of thing, and that keeps you from thinking seriously. I remember whenever I've talked with people who have a much more positive notion of TV, will say, well, that's a very narrow viewpoint, because television has opened us up to the sufferings in the world. We have seen starving children in Africa because of television. We've had documentaries on racism in the United States that help us to deal with that problem, so that it's a very mixed bag. So, I mean, I don't know how you're going to sort that out, but I'm looking at, if the society really is addictive, then you're going to have to point to some ways that it causes that. I mean, the way, how it operates on us. So I'm throwing out TV is probably one that people would cite along that line. I suppose you could say that we live in a drug culture. Maybe that's another one. I was thinking that maybe all of the idea that every problem that comes up can be solved with a pill of some sort, that probably creates this numbing effect that you're talking about.
Right.
It might relate to nuclear weaponry. I'm thinking of Robert J. Lifton's analysis of psychic numbness that's occurred because of the nuclear threat, that it's too terrible to think about a nuclear holocaust, and that it simply is beyond our comprehension, and therefore we simply set it aside or repress all thoughts of it, thus putting ourselves in a psychic numbness that keeps us from facing the reality.
Yes.
Well, anyway, I'm trying to answer my own question there, I guess.
And you're doing very well.
Of what cultural factors, how that really happens. I mean, what you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I can think of the whole economic system seems to be based on the idea of consuming more and more of unnecessary luxury items, and so somehow we have to be convinced that we need these things. And why do we need them? Well, to feel good about ourselves, because we don't feel that we're worthwhile without them, but to have a brand new sports car makes us just such a much better and more worthwhile person. And other people will be attracted to us because of that. You
think if someone says, I'm feeling depressed, I'm going to go out and shop and buy something, do you think that is sort of innate, or is that culturally induced, do you think?
Well, I have to think that's our consumer culture. I'm sure if you went to Zimbabwe, you would not have that kind of response to somebody who's depressed. They might feel, in a healthy society, I think they would say, I think I'll find somebody I can talk to and just relate to and enjoy life with.
So you would say that our consumerist society sort of promotes that kind of response, that I need to buy something to deal with my depression. Yeah,
there's a popular bumper sticker that says, when the going gets tough, the tough go shopping.
I think I've seen that, yeah. That's a good one.
Yes, it really capsulizes the escapism that we're into, doesn't it?
Do you think we're coming to an age of bumper sticker theology here, or
so.
philosophy? Maybe.
Yes.
I'm always a little leery of these things. I mean, we have to deal with these things in greater depth. But I guess sometimes these little phrases do capture a larger analysis and a more in-depth critique. So what we were looking there for these things in the culture that might make us addictive in our behavior and compulsive in our responses.
Certainly the messages we get, the media is so powerful today, and the number of messages we get each day, numbers in the hundreds, I think, if not thousands, small messages, billboards we pass, radio, TV, newspapers, brochures, everything that's passing in our lives. So we're picking up messages all the time.
So it becomes very difficult to think for yourself. We have this ideal in the culture of being an individual, and we certainly have a lot of individualism. All of this analysis we're doing might begin to call that into question. You realize that? I mean, even something like Robert Bella's book, Habits of the Heart, which claim, what an individualistic culture we have and not concerned about the common good, and I certainly think that's true, but all of this thing would put a slant on this individualism, wouldn't it? It would say that, well, maybe we're not as individualistic as we think. We're more bound up in peer pressure. We're more taken by the signals given to us by the media than we ever suspect.
Yeah, I think there's a way of looking at individualism, or maybe what Schaaf calls a characteristic of an addicted society, self-centeredness. And it's not being healthy about yourself, or self-aware, or self-caring. That can be healthy. Self-centeredness is kind of thinking of the world as always in reaction to you. Like everything that happens is either for or against you. She points out that the government of the U.S. often operates this way. Any little movement in a faraway country somewhere is always interpreted in terms of how will this affect us? Are they pro or con U.S.? And do we have to take steps to intervene? And so on. People do this individually in their own lives, that everything that happens affects them. So you have, the mother whose son breaks his leg, and she says, "What have you done to me?" Because she's thinking of all the hardships this is going to incur on her.
Yeah, and that's a telling example, isn't it?
Yeah, and maybe that's, in a sense, that can be very individualistic in a unhealthy way. But there is a healthy way of operating out of the self. And I think if you have a good sense of self, there's almost a paradox here, and it's like the paradox in the gospel. When you lose yourself, you will find yourself. Well, when you find yourself, then you can lose yourself. But first you have to find yourself and accept yourself, and then you can lose yourself, because then you can stop being self-conscious and just act.
That gets back to the saying of Jesus that we are to love others, but love them as we love ourselves.
Yes, right.
And so that we find it rooted, the ability to reach out and to form healthy relationships really is rooted in the ability to love oneself. It is out of self-confidence that we can enter into healthy relationships.
I once read a definition of love as being the overflow of good feeling we have about ourselves toward others.
That's good. The overflow of good feeling. And then that would lead us to willing the good of others.
Yes.
And enable us to do that.
Sure.
Well, okay, Karen, so we're seeing these influences from the culture and how they program us. Now, how are we going to get beyond this? Or how are we going to make some progress to not fall into this trap of simply accepting the cultural assumptions?
Well, I'll tell you what Ann Wilson Schaaf suggests in her book. She says that let's turn to the 12-step program. As it works with addicted people, she says it can work on a cultural-wide basis. She calls the 12-step program, in fact, a living process system, because it's a way of getting out of the addicted, kind of zombie-like system that we're in, into this kind of wonderful, what she calls extravagant living, and I like that term. She doesn't mean spending money wildly. She means just living fully for the moment and enjoying life. And
couldn't we put that in theological terms and say we would live in response to the Spirit,
Sure.
We talk about the Spirit breathing
Sure.
where she wills, and the Spirit sort of having this energy, and the Spirit, us being temples of the Holy Spirit. Maybe that would be a way of saying it in religious terms, that we live out of the power of the Spirit, and the Spirit can use us as a vehicle, and therefore we have a certain zest for life and a care for people and so on.
That's right. I think it also is very holistic in the sense we feel tied up with the rest of the universe. I think of a favorite line from Our Town where Emily comes back from the dead, and she's saying to somebody, does anybody realize how wonderful, how beautiful life is as they're living it? And somebody responds, well, maybe poets and saints do.
I think I remember that line. Yeah.
And
the poets and the saints.
Yeah, that really hits at our lack of awareness, I think.
So that's the first step here. I mean, we got to be aware of the power of the culture and the messages it's giving us, and then I presume what we've got to do is try to move beyond that in some way. I was thinking of the whole competitive thing in that regard, how hard it is to get out of that. In other words, we as a country, we need to be number one. We need to be right. We are the Messiah in the world and the world's policeman, and any sort of competition, it hurts us if we can't defeat the others. And then, of course, that gets played down all the way through the various strata of our society and plays its way into the various communities that we belong to. And, boy, it's so hard to move beyond that. I suppose one way is sort of redirect the energy. Rather than fighting it directly, that's saying maybe, well, I'll remain competitive in a way, but I'll compete against my own potential. I'll compete against my own abilities. Maybe that would be a way of moving forward towards greater mutuality in relationships, for example. And
to maybe reject the characteristic that Schaaf calls the zero-sum model, as if when something good happens to somebody else, that's going to deprive us of anything good happening, because there's only a certain amount of good available in the world. And we live under this illusion. So much, many of the things we do seem to respond, or it's our reaction out of that assumption, that false assumption. The
zero-sum model. Yeah. So I wonder if that isn't the root of a lot of jealousy. If somebody else moves ahead, then that is going to hurt me in some way.
Sure, yes, I think it is. But, I think maybe we just need to go back to the fact of just being aware. That's so important, to be aware of these messages, because I think most people can go through life not being aware and just realize something is not quite right with their life. And maybe what they require is almost a devastating thing to happen. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they call it bottoming out. I think you could do that for anybody who's even not addicted when they find out that, gee, what is life about? I think this happens sometimes when people lose somebody very close to them to death, or it could be divorce for a person. You suddenly find the person that you were kind of basing a meaning for your life is gone, and so now you have to figure out what does matter. Or people who lose their jobs, I think that they can hit that bottoming out and come to some awareness of what really are priorities in my life. What does matter? It would seem that it's really crucial from our Christian perspective to talk here about putting on the mind of Christ, of being able to see the world in a different way. I often think of morality not so much as gritting our teeth and forcing ourselves to behave in ways that seem counter to our own best interest, but rather a more spontaneous, easygoing, free-flowing sort of thing where we automatically see the world through the eyes of Christ. Yes. That the biblical Jesus that's presented to us in the Gospels does really become our example of how we try to live, that the Gospel forms the grid through which we look at the world. So that if we were able to put on the mind of Christ and make the gospel be very real to us in our everyday lives, then we would begin to see the world differently. We would have sort of an inner challenge to those assumptions right within us. We wouldn't always need the prophet to say, hey, don't do it this way, or don't fall into the consumerism in the culture, or the success ethic, or any of the other isms, nationalism that can take us over. But there would be sort of an inner gyroscope that is given to one by the religion, by the symbol system that we call Christianity, with Jesus Christ at the center. That would become our way of interacting with our world. And I think what we would find there is a whole different set of values then.
and a different perspective on looking at human existence. It would be far less competitive, far bigger on mutuality in relationships. There would be a concern for the common good and not just for one's private good. There would be a great concern to create peace and harmony in the world, reconciliation, rather than sowing the seeds of strife. So I could see there a way of within oneself saying, I won't fall prey to this addictive society. I won't let it sort of co-opt me or pull me into some false way of living here. So maybe maybe that becomes our real key here, is the gospel and the model of Christ.
Yeah, putting on the mind of Christ, to me, brings out the idea of what's most important is what Jesus found most important, his relationship with God. And if we do the same, if we turn to our own inner relationship with God, with our higher power, as 12-step people say, that relationship is core, that's central, and then we'll act spontaneously out of that relationship. But that has to be there, and that's why, in effect, the solution to this addicted society is a spiritual one. Finding what matters, what really matters, what is our priority, is that spiritual relationship we have with God.
I think so often when you look deeper at human problems, you come up with the notion that they are spiritual in nature and need religious kinds of solutions. And then I think that's a way of saying how practical our Christian faith is and how well our Judeo-Christian tradition can work for us.
Yeah. One thing that
Karen, you have to compress. We got 30 seconds.
Okay. One thing that just comes to mind is that the sense of the 12-step program, as Alan Wilson Schaaf says, is being a process. It's ongoing. It's recovering, not recovered. And so it's something we always are working at. And therefore, we don't have to be perfect today because we're always working at it. It's the process that's important, not the goal.
Well, that seems really good advice. We do live in a society which is addictive in many ways, and so we're going to have to be patient with ourselves as we try to put on the mind of Christ in order to deal more effectively with those compulsions.